Welcome to Climate 360. If you were lucky enough to see the last episode with Professor Dan Hill, you will have heard him unpack the carbon reduction roadmap report that he has produced along with Gerard Reinmuth from UTS and his team at Melbourne University. This week he did have it was a long interview and it was a very good interview, so we decided to cut it in two, and in part two the conversation broadens out into kind of wider issues of land, property value, capital, and indeed politics. We hope you enjoy it. So the elephant in the room at this point, I would have thought, is capital, which is to say that there's a lot of sunk capital in the cities that people want to extract value from, but maybe more importantly, land, the value of land, and what could be recouped in value from building on land, is pretty codified.
Yeah.
It's pretty kind of almost, as far as most developers are concerned, pretty settled. You know, you put your spreadsheet together and you work out your areas, your ratios, your heights, the cost of a core, blah, blah, blah. You work out how things stack up, right? So that's just a big old train rumbling along in the background saying, yeah, sure, okay, but, you know, this is how we do it. So is it fair to say that what you're looking at and the kind of things we would need to do demand, as much as we need to rewire our kitchen, we need to rewire the way that capital is used, disposed of, exploited, valued?
Yeah.
Okay. Discuss.
And next question. So, yeah, I mean.
Now we get to the less low hanging fruit.
No, exactly, the easy ones. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of good, solid economic analysis that we're valuing the wrong things in capital at the minute, as we don't tend to tax land much. We tend to see the value in the property end of stuff. That seems the wrong way around from a lot of economists' point of view, but actually the land is the wealthy bit there. Property developers tend to, acquire the right to build on a land with a long-term lease. The building is the thing that they sell, the thing that they make value from. So we don't tend to tax that enough either, by the way. But certainly we don't have much in the way of a meaningful land tax here. And that is weird if you think about it, because my friend Indy Johar points this one out. You could build a building in the middle of Melbourne, plonk it down there. It's clearly worth a lot of money, right? Exactly the same building in the middle of Siberia. What's it worth then? Not much.
Yeah.
It's literally the same building in terms of physicality, aesthetics, everything. So what you're really valuing there is your spatial proximity to the centre of Melbourne in that case, which are other things actually. It's public infrastructure, metro systems, libraries, places of work, the streets, things like that. So, but we don't tend to tax that. We don't tend to value that quite the same way. So there's a lot in our model at the moment that doesn't tend towards genuinely valuing land. We know that the current model also tends towards inequalities. Why do we have a housing crisis? It's because we've incentivized a way of acquiring houses as financial assets.
Yeah.
It's not fair.
Totally.
It is clearly not producing fair outcomes out of the system. So, never mind taking into account what economists call the externalities of all that stuff, which is the emissions and all the things we've been talking about. So none of that stuff is captured in the current economic model. That's why we're finding it quite so hard to address climate change or social equity, actually, either of them.
Yeah.
So we should have enough red warning lights on the dashboard now to say, well, this is wrong. This is not the right way to go from a broader public good or common good, however you want to describe it, point of view. We're far better qualified people than to talk about that. Mariana Max-Carswell and other, like economists who look at Josh Ryan Collins on land value and things like that. But there's enough there to tell us that the system is not working. Yeah. So the idea that it's a train rolling kind of is, but it's not rolling in a common good direction at this point.
Sure. I guess it's for many people in the design industry or in the architecture and building industry, the first part of what we were talking about in terms of materials and about recycling and custodianship of materials is somewhat familiar, and it also feels like the kind of thing that to some extent can happen incrementally. You can see how a new product suddenly comes out, it becomes popular, it's been tested, and all of a sudden you get 6 copycats, and you got a change in the whole kind of cycle of materials.
Although I would say that it doesn't happen that quickly and doesn't happen much.
Not quickly, no.
I worked with some of the
Yeah.
Arab ones, Trisham McCarthy, who said the last real innovation in buildings was reinforced concrete. That was like 1925. We haven't really had much since then. He said from like a structural material point of view. So
Yeah.
he was kind of overplaying it to make the point, but it does make you think actually, when did we have a sudden innovation on material that then moved through the industry?
No, not in that sense. But
Yeah.
you probably could say that in the last generation, there's been a move away from plastics and certain kind of polymers and back to some other kind of materiality that's less kind of associated with.
Not in most buildings. If you go to the average suburban development, on the edge of Melbourne, which is what most buildings is.
True. Sorry, I'm probably thinking of different markets.
You're thinking of lovely buildings like this.
Yeah.
Fair enough. But like most buildings being built in Australia are chock full of plastic, not enough insulation, flat roofs, and the hottest continent on the planet, stripping away the landscape.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, you know.
Yeah. But so that's an interesting kind of challenge in a way. Is that if we can't even get to the point of taking black off our roof, so that maybe we can pull back the urban heat down effect. Sometimes it's hard to say, okay, let's transform.
Sure, although that's these are just the way I look at that. Though, that is like one line of code, and I mean code in both senses.
Yes,
like the building code, but also if you think of the building code as the code that writes the city, the computer code does. One line of code to change that. Now, New South Wales more or less, I think, got that one through our own black roofs, I believe. No,
Voluntary. It's a voluntary code.
So on the way.
Yeah.
Victoria hasn't yet.
Yeah.
But again, that seems to me like you're not having to rebuild entire supply chains and make new factories, reforest Victoria,
Yeah.
So those are low-hanging fruit to your point. And again, one line of code in the building code and you'd be away with that. And we need to do those.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. I guess I'm trying to work out, because in a sense, what we started this conversation with is that we have this MacGuffin, we have this thing which is big, bit of calculation, which tells you we have to radically do things differently.
Yeah.
I can see how that could catalyze conversation in the industry in terms of materials and recycling. I can see that may not be 5 years or 10 years out, but you can see that there's a movement there. What I'm struggling with is what the equivalent first steps are, the early adopters, the first moves when it comes to capital and property, because they feel almost more entrenched than the use of concrete.
Yeah, so, well, two things. One, just briefly on the materials side, I'd say, that is something where you can imagine we can get designers and others excited about it. There's rich possibilities there. It feels like a creative challenge. I'd just say that is not happening and hasn't happened for a long time, with few honourable exceptions. So if I'm not an architect, I come from a design background generally, but I know people that work at Apple or name your big smartphone manufacturer, they know where the materials come from. The designers know where the materials come from and make an AirPod. They go to the factories in Shenzhen and they track that stuff down. People in the fashion industry increasingly know. They go to the factory in Italy and see, is it actually being made there with cotton from Pakistan or not? So we are not doing that at all with buildings. There are no material passports in place, and most architects and designers are at best haven't thought about it. At worst, deliberately ignoring it, so they can do a kind of design from 20 years ago, which I find very frustrating. So, as you can tell.
Okay.
So let's just sort out the fact that materials is part of architecture fundamentally, and make sure that we know where our stuff is coming from. I know we're, as you said earlier, stewardship and custodianship all the way through the supply chain and out the other end of it.
Yeah.
Again, cars now have end-of-life producer responsibility in Europe, places like that. You have to take the car back, take it apart at the end of life, recycle it properly. We don't have anything like that with buildings in place. So we're way behind other sectors. So just a little caveat, the footnote on your first point, but it is genuinely thrilling. So the second bit on capital, again, I think the thing we're missing in Australia is, weirdly, the answer is government. So I don't mean that in a sense of we just need more big government. I just mean that markets are designed and shaped, and the job of policymakers is to shape a market, design a market. Market isn't a thing outside of government or the public sector. They set the rules by which the market operates. Capital is part of the market, it exists within it. So it's just a component of the market. The thing that we're missing is the idea of any kind of steering hand towards the common good, this idea of tilting the playing field on the public sector, government side. Very weak tradition in Australia. And you can see the results. We have the least complex economy in the OECD. Pretty much all of them, top 30, 40 countries in there. Basically, the money in Australia has always just come from extraction, first agriculture, then mining. That's where the whole wealth comes from. Everything else is just small change. So there is very little steering going on because it's basically taking care of itself economically through colonial and export. Still the case. So we're missing something in the control room, the steering room. There's nobody with their hand on the tiller. Coming to your point about, let's say, the property market, that would say growth in itself isn't a valid metric. Growth has a direction and a dynamic to it. So if we said, what would be a use for capital within the sector? That's a great question. We don't have that question in play in public. At best, it's like, we just need to make 200,000 homes. Or we need to get the CBD rolling again. We need to see new buildings being opened. It's like, but what kind of buildings? Why? How? That's what I mean by the direction. How are they, in this context, how are they made? What are they made of?
We do know that, we do know that in Australia that there's a history of looking at exemplars in other countries, and somehow those exemplars influencing outcomes. I think, as much as I'm not the biggest fan of Jan Gehl in the world, when he came to Sydney over successive times, that there was a shift in some attitudes towards key public spaces. That was valuable.
Same in
And it
Melbourne.
was partly because he talked with a different accent, and he brought a kind of a exactly, convincing. And so I guess one question would be not so much to do with materials, etc., but in terms of the kind of the relationship between governance, government, capital, and our cities. Maybe other than Denmark, where can you see some of this conversation around how we do things more sustainably in terms of the use of buildings and reuse of buildings, not just the materials that build them? Where is there interesting thinking?
Well, a lot of European countries are. I hate as a European, I hate just to say, the answer is Europe, because it's not that simple, and Europe has its own issues more than most of the continent. Nonetheless, when you look at buildings, zooming in on that bit, France has got an amazing set of policies now around timber, essentially first in its buildings. Hugely impressive. Belgium, again, has become this leader in reused buildings and practices around that. Most of the Nordic countries, incredibly high bar, particularly for public buildings, and that includes a lot of housing and a lot of schools and all of those things and infrastructure and so on. So Switzerland, Austria, Heartland, across some mass timber, all of that stuff, which is usually grown in the Nordics. So Italy and Spain will be places to explore this because their population's going to be half the size by the end of the century. So they're going to be left with a load of empty buildings, which will be capable of being retrofitted in very nice little Italian towns. So there's that is impressive, I think. There's a lot of things, again, just to kind of dig deep into now. The next questions about, are all materials coming from there? Are those forests sustainably resourced? You can keep going with that line of inquiry. Never a perfect answer. But I'd say those countries are genuinely shifting the way they're thinking about this stuff.
And do you have any first thoughts, or what was the word you've used before, hunches, for what the key to changing attitudes in Australia would be to make anything like that have an appetite here? What do we need to do? Because you're making this report, and the report's asking big questions. And the natural consequence of big questions is behavior change. And yet it's very entrenched.
Well, I would say that this is where we can be inspired by places overseas, but we need to make demonstrators of things here, like prototypes, living experiments, places for people to encounter something different. And the reason I'm stressing that word encounter is I don't think this is a case of changing attitudes. So I'm very clear about with that number, for instance. I mean, the number by itself is useless. Or even the idea of 98%, like what do I just do? Email that to Anthony Albanese and he just forwards it on to all at Australia. You know,
FYI.
you know, just saying, turns out we need to drop our carbon emissions. Who knew? Well, everybody knows already. You know, pretty much, mostly everybody, and mostly people want some kind of action to happen as well. So this isn't a question of knowing. It's a question of experiencing and knowing that actually it could be different. Because we go back to like, how would you change the building code? We need some kind of sense that would be a groundswell of opinion that would be the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And you can't just change a law if it's counter what you currently think everybody in the country might think.
Totally.
The problem is we don't really know, because no one, you know, if we said to people on the street, we start talking about, so what do you think of embodied emissions within the National Construction Code? You know, well, I don't know any of those words.
Yeah.
Or they know them individually, but not in that order.
Yeah.
So it's not a thing that is, so that law just sits there like that, kind of untroubled by all of this stuff, untroubled by the emissions burning over here and public opinion over here. So what we need to do is create a movement of some kind of demonstration of people saying, this looks interesting, perhaps we could do more like this. It's the very basic theory of change.
Yeah.
So it's not a case of changing people's attitude, again, just them knowing the answer and then lobbying the politician automatically. People kind of in abstract know. They need to understand, well, my neighborhood could be like this somehow.
Yeah.
Or the supermarket I go to is now built of a different material. Now it seems lovely. Like, why is that? You know?
Yeah.
Oh, how did I get there? Well, it turned out that I didn't realize this, but I could get my groceries delivered on an e-bike for actually cheaper than me driving to the shops, you know. And so those aren't things that people are going to probably vote for or express an interest in. It's something that they need to encounter and experience. And then their attitude begins to change afterwards, as I understand the way that behavior change works. Once we can do that at scale, this is the work, some of the work we do in Sweden, like demonstrate change on the ground. That gives lawmakers and policymakers enough courage, basically, to get into, okay, this is something that we could then generalize. So go from this specific instance here. Turns out that 80% of people were in favour of e-bike deliveries from our mass timber version of Coles. How would we get to that? Well, that's what policymakers and regulators can do. But we're not going to get people saying, can you change the construction code for me? Like average people on the ground. They don't care about those things. They care about their groceries coming to them in a sustainable way.
Yeah, they clearly they care about what we're currently calling a housing crisis.
Mm-hmm.
You think it's maybe slightly...
Well, it's cost of living as well. I do also think people care about sustainability generally. If you said to people, would you rather be unsustainable or sustainable? Very few people would vote for unsustainable. Like genuine.
True. Right. But that's not the question generally they're being asked.
No.
Would you put up with a little bit of less sustainability if you had an extra bedroom? I'm not sure too many people say, yeah, I'll forgo that extra bedroom to have a little bit more sustainability. This is the
challenge at the moment. We've got 1.3 million houses with 3+ extra bedrooms, spare bedrooms, unused bedrooms in Australia.
Do that figure again. What is it?
1.3 million. I think this is right off the top of my head.
Yeah.
This is ABS statistics from the last census in 2012. 1.3 million houses with 3 or more unused
spare rooms.
Yeah, unused. So it's not that we've just got, like, an extra room is fine. Anybody can always use an extra room. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
And so usually the housing geeks on this side talk about that being a perfectly valid thing for any household to have.
Yeah.
You know, if your mates or your families can stay or to use
Sure.
it to study, whatever.
Yeah.
The issue is we've been building way beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
We've got 600,000 completely empty homes in Australia. We've got 13 million unused bedrooms.
Wow.
We've only got like 150,000 homeless people.
So it's not a housing shortage.
It's a glut
It's a housing allocation
on the
issue.
private,
Yeah.
the owned side. If you look at public housing or community-led housing, that's a different matter.
Yeah.
We've got one of the lowest amounts of public housing in the OECD again.
Yeah.
So this is where I said again, the emissions budget thinking is really interesting, because if you say we've got a budget, therefore we should use this carefully, sparingly. Therefore, what are the things we actually need to build with this, again, this precious budget we've got? Let's say it's emissions or materials. The only gap in the Australian housing market is public housing and community-led housing, like cooperatives and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So we'd spend the budget on public housing.
Wow.
Which, that would be interesting, because then we'd be able to use public procurement to also lift innovation, to the point about demonstrators. So
Yeah.
coming back to your point about theory of change.
Yeah.
Public housing, if you think about it, again, 100 years ago, that was how concrete became popular, mainly through publicly led demonstration projects at scale.
Of course.
So the way that we've shifted material palettes in the past has been heavily influenced public sector, building out new cities, new houses, stuff like that. So what if we did that now? So public procurement, again, you can be using private architects and developers, or you can build those things in-house, or probably a bit of both, good mix. And you're building beautiful public housing with local materials made carefully by local manufacturers and builders, local jobs, all of that. Super easy story to wrap up from a policy point of view. It's like win-win-win-win. And that would get us from, roughly, let's say, the 2 to 3% public housing we have now, up to something that, let's say it's 10%. Even 10% is half of what it is in the UK, which is about 18-19% anyway. The Netherlands is 29% public housing.
Yeah.
So you look at equivalent wealthy countries, roughly same GDP per capita as Australia. That's your Swedens and your Netherlands. We are an order of magnitude less in terms of our public housing provision. So
Yes.
it's no surprise we've got a housing affordability crisis. We've got it all on the privately owned sector. There's no way that you can then say to people, well, would you mind your house price coming down a bit, please? Because you've told them that this is your superannuation, and you asked them to invest in it because the price will always go up. So it can't come down. So it's by definition unaffordable. If real wages aren't going up, which they show no sign of doing, to the same degree as the mortgage, you can't solve affordability just by pouring more houses onto that market.
Yeah.
Even if you built the housing targets, which we're not, probably just as well from a carbon point of view, that shifts the house price, in the very small percentages.
So that kind of leads, and maybe just to round out this conversation, that leads to a question around where this report is intended to be received, who the audiences are. You've got your design community, you've got your policy community, you've got your wider industry community, and you've got your general public, and probably others. Could you talk us through those audiences and how this report is looking for different audiences?
Yeah, our first audience really is industry. And it's a little bit, again, following the logic of the Danes, and we should probably come back to, is Denmark the same as Australia? Clearly it isn't. But there are interesting possibilities in the idea of an industry-led movement, I think. So it doesn't often happen here, at least, I think. I believe that we could get a whole bunch of practices, at least, on the design and architecture and engineering side interested in this. Certainly we're seeing interest from it left, right, and centre. We did a little session here with a bunch of leading practices, big and small, and they were, first of all, sort of shocked by the numbers, and secondly, all agree we should do something about this, and the answer probably is changing the construction codes, and then we can invent and innovate wildly in that direction. So I think that is a very good discussion to start having, and then beginning to move that into developers, probably super funds that invest in property, those kinds of sectors. That begins to build a kind of a solid mass on this much broader idea of the industry side. After that, I think the key message that we're trying to get at really, again, is policymakers, regulators, probably politicians to some degree. So I'd be interested in some of the political parties that are more interested in this kind of thing. They'd be obvious people to get involved in spreading the message around it, for sure. But really it gets into policy and regulators. So then we're looking at the federal government. They have interest in all of these areas.
Yeah.
Biomaterials and manufacturing and future made in Australia strategy, things like that. It's the industrial policy. Doesn't mention construction at all.
It doesn't.
No, barely mentions circularity. So just
wow.
So that's something that again we would want to get in front of, effectively, Jim Chalmers, and say, look, this is actually one of the biggest sectors in Australia in terms of
in terms of carbon emissions.
And emissions, exactly. But this is the thing, people haven't been thinking about the built environment, certainly on the materials side, as emissions. All of the rhetoric, as you know, has been around energy. We've got to get off coal-fired power stations and just we do. Transport, again, we need to do that too. To some extent, and operational stuff like LED lights and insulation. That's all true. We need to do all of those things. But this one is really, you'd be surprised by, policymakers at the highest level of various governments I've spoken to in Australia who have not thought about this at all. Whereas the circularity or the opportunity for Australian industry. So I think that's the story. It goes that way. To be frank, Andrew, I don't know. That is not a strategy. So it's, what do you say? A hunch. Because I also think that this is dealing with complexity, as you pointed out right at the start. It's a massively set of complex questions to do with complex systems. So this is the last thing actually where the language of roadmaps is that useful in reality, because a roadmap usually is we'll do this, then we'll do this, then we'll do this, then we'll do this.
It's kind of A to B.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I know it's not like that, which again is why we're just using it basically to say, let's get the attention, let's then get around a table and thrash it out together. What are the series of actually small moves, interventions, demonstrators? Let's say we get, again, we trigger the idea of public housing genuinely being a showcase systems demonstrator thing. Let's build one or two of those.
Yeah.
Or do future homes but in this direction or something like that. These pattern books that are beginning to emerge, fantastic, but we don't really talk about embodied carbon materials much. What if they did? Those things are actually quite powerful because they can then shift public perception, industry practices. They give us insights as to policy changes or regulatory changes that we should make.
Yeah.
So instead of starting with regulation and policy, although it looks like we're asking for that, what we really want to get to are demonstrators, again, changes in public, and those things leave a kind of vapor trail, if you like, of insights, which you can crystallize into policy and law.
Right, okay.
It kind of goes that way around.
Right. A vapor trail crystallized into policy.
Exactly. Well, I mean, this is the thing. Again, it's the reverse of the logic, which usually says policy making is like, you get a bunch of bright people in a room like this, you lock them in there for 5 days, they pop out with a Word document. It's like, that is not how it works anymore. The world is way more complex than that. You can't get all of the people in a room by definition, and the knowledge is not what my friend Marco calls document knowledge, as in some of it you can write down, but some of it is embodied or enacted or experienced forms of knowledge, and that isn't something you can just put in track changes in a Word document. So making these, this is where design is really good though, isn't it? Because design creates settings for you to encounter ideas. So the idea of, let's say, embodied materials or something is abstract to most people. But whenever you make a building, that's what it's doing.
True.
And we just wanted to say, well, point it in a good direction, not in a bad direction.
Let's maybe round this off by, first of all, I want to recap. I'll probably just edit this a little bit here because you mentioned your team. It'd be great for us to to rephrase. Here we are in MSD, your team, and also the wider UST, because I know will what the fuck?
No, exactly. He will.
So we'll do that. Yeah. But also you mentioned like signing up. Like how do you get involved? So we'll just recap that.
So do that, and I'll go and take some distance shots as well.
We'll just do that first of all.
Just do that.
2 minutes, and then we'll a couple of shots, and then we'll let him get it so he can think about his next thing with a few minutes to spare. So we're here at the
talking to them. I said, maybe we should do something in Australia about that. simultaneously, in the way that these things often go, I also have one foot in the Nordics quite often, and asked them the same thing. I literally just sent an email to whatever it was, hello@reductionroadmap.dk, saying, love your work, tell me more, how can we help? And got talking to people at Sebra and Effect Architects who are behind it on the Danish side. So Gerard and I have been sort of this slightly haphazard crap pincer movement, sort of locating the Danes. But we've known each other for 20 odd years or so, and so we quickly found out about this and started talking to each other, saying we should do something together. So he mobilized a few folk at TERROIR as well, who've been really useful here. Mikkel in Denmark and Sarah Jane in Sydney. I happen to have some of Australia's best academics or experts around life cycle analysis and emissions and things like that here in-house at University of Melbourne. That's Rob Crawford, James Helal, and André, Stephan, and a lab called EPIC, which stands for Environmental Performance in Construction, who they make a database of all of the materials used in buildings and their profiles, essentially. So they became incredibly useful in then doing these bottom-up calculations required to figure out the average emissions pumped out when we make a house in Australia.
Yeah.
And then Tim Schork at QUT as well also became part of this collective, supporting it from Brisbane, but also increasingly, as all of us are now doing industry events and doing public events actually around it. So there's one in Brisbane in a few weeks' time. I'm going to Sydney in a couple of weeks' time to do something at UTS. So we're just simmering the pot basically around this, and then we've started pulling in our wider networks too, with the basis that it becomes again an open movement. So if you go to the website at reductionroadmap.au now, no longer just DK, you'll see a link to the Danish one, but a place where you can download the Australian numbers, what they're worth. But it's also got this kind of back few pages on what next, and it kind of hints at possible ways forward without really telling people too much what to do.
Right.
But basically hinting at probably these kinds of changes are required and more. But enables people to sign up to it. And what you're signing up to, the ask really is just, we would like to see climate science meaningfully recognized in the National Construction Code. What that means is taking into account these emissions limits for buildings. And we can set a cascading set of emissions limits towards the future.
Yeah.
Just so you don't have to drop overnight, but still. So that's the story of the roadmap we got from here.
Yeah.
From there to here, and with some of the characters involved.
And building a community as fast as you can, because 2030 is not so far away.
No, I mean, it's one where one would hope that the government would see these things coming and change their own regulations. This climate science is not exactly hidden.
Yeah.
It's well known. We've been banging on it, as you know, for 2 decades plus.
Yeah.
And what hasn't really been thought through is the link to things like built environment enough, particularly buildings. And so that's something I would hope again that the government would just be ahead of the curve rather than behind it. But they're not, as far as I can tell, as far as we can tell.
Yeah.
So effectively we're saying, I think there's enough people in the industry now that would want to bring the regulation forward so that we can actually get on with making the kind of buildings and spaces that we know that we can.
Yeah.
But we just need that regulation exists to make that equitable. There's no point in me making a nice one or you making a nice one. We need to ensure that any Australian building is handled in this way. That's what regulation's for.
Well, we're filming this before the election, and it will probably be broadcast after the election. So I guess only fate will know.
Well, I mean, this is an interesting thing, isn't it? Because as you point out, the housing crisis, it seems, is very easy to motivate people's attention around. It seems easy to understand.
Yeah.
We don't have enough houses, because therefore we need to build some more houses, then the house price will come down so that it's more affordable. And none of that stuff seems to really be the case in reality. So, and that's not even talking about the emissions associated with the project, which has been 90% of what we've talked about. So it is, this is what we're trying to do. It's why we, perhaps more than the Danes, we more directly linked the question of emissions to housing targets,
Yeah.
because we knew that that would actually give it a kind of a political imperative and therefore get attention.
Yeah.
Whether it gets attention usefully or not will remain to be seen.
Not to be a total downer on it, but we are just today, some weeks before the election, seeing front page news, both kind of centre left, centre right, both saying the same thing, that there's both sides have been committing a kind of cash splash to housing, whichever one is saying will drive up the prices of houses.
Yeah.
Like everyone knows.
Well, it can't come down, can it?
Yeah.
I mean, every Australian, like 60% of the electorate that own property, they're not voting for the price to come down in reality. That's their money.
Yeah.
Or do they think? So,
Well, at the same time, they're worrying about how little Johnny's going to get an apartment, like my little Johnny. How he's going to get an apartment. So we're caught. Again, it's how we understand the challenges in front of us.
yeah, exactly. That we have, it's like we're just picking up the same hammer every single time and hoping somehow that it will produce music or something. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not going to do something different. A privatized housing market's really what we've got. 98%, 97%
Yeah.
cannot be equitable in that sense. So we do need, people should have somewhere to live. Obviously, a home is I genuinely believe it's the most fundamental human right.
Mm. Yeah, totally.
With healthcare, with education, with public transport, with things like that. So that's what we haven't been doing in this country. It's not very fair.
Well, so that's an amazing interview with Dan over 2 weeks, over 2 episodes, and I guess it's good to kind of finish off this episode with a few of our own thoughts around what the key takeaways from that were. I guess for me, Sam, the number one thing that's incredible about that report is the stark number of 98% reduction in carbon emissions from our buildings.
Yeah, it's hard to get your head around.
It is, and in a way, it's like it's a lot of things in climate relate to statistics where it's hard to kind of ground it in your own experience. And I thought, in a way, to kind of like as an analogy, if you think about this, what it means to do a roadmap, it's about how you actually plan to get somewhere and the consequences of the decisions that you make. And it occurred to me that, we're all familiar with the idea that if you want to buy a house, you go out and look at the market and see what you can afford. And then you buy accordingly. It seems if you take that example and you put it in the context of where this report takes us around carbon emissions, it's almost as if, by analogy, you go out to the world and say, I want to buy a big house with 16 rooms and with a swimming pool and 70 acres and a stables and a garage for 10 cars and la 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 la. And there's a dream house out there for me and it's going to cost me $50 million. And it's like, okay, that's my target. I'm going to get to that target. I'm going to go, I get that dream house. And then an accountant does your numbers and then tells you, actually, that's a $50,000 a month, that mortgage, yeah? So you've got one. It's like that shock of like, oh, so I can, okay, so this isn't about me making it from 70 acres to 5 or making it from 10 car carriage to 1.
It's living differently. It's being somebody else.
It means everything about your expectations of what a home is in that sense needs to change. So, I mean, it's a kind of like a rather dumb analogy in a way, but it's like there's certain things in this world that we know that if we want to get there, there's no other option than to figure out what's the monthly servicing of a mortgage. What can I get for that? Well, that's my roadmap. It's 25 years of X amount a month. And it seems staggering to me that we've got this far into the conversation about climate, and only at this point, they go off and do, there's a research done where like we're nowhere near where we need to be. We are 98% off where we need to be. Yeah. And that's a staggering starting point.
It is, and it can be a little bit of a shock and awe, but I was really intrigued with the scale of time that we were reminded of, that this is not so much a new problem. If you stand back and think about a longer time frame, It's only recently we've stopped knowing where the materials that we build with come from. It's only recently that they've stopped being local materials that come from nearby, things that we might call biomaterials and seem to be a new technology, or often a revisited or a remembered technology. And so there's a lot of reason to be optimistic that as we turn to materials that we're not familiar with, that there's a long human history of using those materials and using them beautifully in ways that are effective.
Yeah.
It's different, but it's not less, and it's not unknown.
And you know, when we get on to the full interview with Jost Bakker, is a good example. He talks about the visiting California and a factory being built basically to make particle board, but to make it from straw. As opposed from wood chips, and in that situation, the reason I mention that is that it's in one way one of the most simple materials you can use. Stramit has in Sweden has been making that compressed straw for generations, post-war, whatever, for a long time. And now we're just going into this new age where it feels like there's an opportunity to research things like natural resins and natural materials and bring all the contemporary tech that we can bring and the equipment that we can bring, but essentially, reverting to materials that are centuries old.
But high performance in their capacity or capability.
Yeah,
I agree.
I thought another thing that was interesting about Dan's conversation was the not only was it an academic report or a business report or a professional report, it was this roadmap that had enough energy behind it to actually change policy. And as the little slide showed, Denmark is the first country in the world to mandate in policy and in law a cap on carbon emissions in building. But what was really critical there, as Dan mentioned, is that this wasn't government top down saying, it will be so. Actually, there were a number of different players, number of different institutions, but also the market, the industry itself, sensing that this is where it's going and wanting to get ahead, as it were. And so this move towards reducing their carbon emissions, which admittedly in this policy change is a relatively small increment at this point from business as usual. Like the carbon emissions per square meter is X amount business as usual. So they've mandated a reduced level, and they've got an idea of that, basically year on year going down and down. But that being in a way a collaboration, not just government, not just market, not just different institutions and the academy. It's all of these parties working together. That gives me a bit of hope. Was there any hope for you in the presentation?
Well, one of the things that really felt empowering in hearing how Dan tackled it was in connecting the crises and saying they're not different crises. We talked a lot about housing, and we're exploring issues of climate change, and they're not different, and yet we don't talk about them at the same time. And in dealing with the challenges that lie ahead, if we tackle them through the built environment, as the current example that we're exploring, that's actually a big lever. And it's a big lever that if we understand it in the context of climate change, not just the need for people to live well, we can actually tackle the need to build a lot more housing capacity, while also doing that in a way that is not carbon intensive, and both in the initial build and ongoing, it starts to become part of the solution. So the idea that we can't afford it, there's a number of examples that came up that made it clear how much money we are spending on some pretty big projects, that those decisions could actually be reframed to take into account the simultaneous issue of climate change.
Yeah.
If we need that transport solution, yes, but we also have climate change. Can we do them both?
It is one of the most frustrating things that it feels like we do silos very well in government, state, local, federal. We do silos exceptionally well. And so there's one boffin working out how many tens of thousands of people have to move from this place to this place, and somebody else is working out how much roads that takes, and da da da. But they're not joining the dots. And as Dan quite rightly says, is that you can have a policy around cleaning up your environment, cleaning up your carbon emissions. But if you think you're going to solve the housing issue simply by replicating the supply methodologies that you've been using for the last generation, there's just no way that you can meet your climate emissions. So you're right. The idea that climate targets and housing targets, if you're not looking at them in a synthetic way,
Yeah.
then we're all a bit stuffed.
But the good news being that's a way of accessing budget we know we're going to spend in a different way by thinking about it up front in a different way to make some changes.
Yeah.
And that's where the example projects you talked about, we'll hear a little later in the series from people who can share with us their demonstration projects. It's Joost and the Woodley's regenerative studio, but Hassel have really done a lot of work there. And in fact, Sam Pert, who we meet from Hassel, when she was with the Victorian government, led some procurement processes that actually flushed out whole changes in what people were getting for their bulk housing contracts. So that's to come. But the interconnectedness as a both a way of understanding more clearly, but finding more solutions too.
Yeah. And on that note, I'll a little teaser for next week. Doug Rennie from Hillston in New South Wales, a farmer who has his own unique engagement with building materials. But you're gonna have to wait for next week to see that. So join us next week.
See you next week.